Good evening. Tonight we are going to be chatting about A Net for Small Fishes by Lucy Jago. I have to say, this cover is so beautiful.
The cover.
I'm a huge fan, I don't know if you can see, of these end papers, which you'll see why they are very relevant to the story, but it's a beautiful cover. Before we start talking about this, I feel I should just point out that I am not somebody who is an avid reader of historical fiction at all. I am a massive Hilary Mantel fan, but I think Hilary sort of stands on her own. I feel like she's a historian, really.
Oh yeah,
she is. I think having studied history, it sometimes, I feel for me personally, it sometimes makes reading historical fiction difficult in that I am often questioning whether something happened or whether it's
right.
fiction. And I think the point is, it doesn't really matter, just enjoy the book. But it's meant that I've tended to avoid historical fiction. So this wasn't something I would have ordinarily picked up, but that's what's so good about reading in this way together. So thank you for pushing me out of my comfort zone.
And did you love it?
Do you know what? I have to say, I was really, really pleasantly surprised by it. It was beautifully written, and it really took me into another world. We'll discuss the characters shortly, but I think it did help that these aren't historical figures who are hugely known about. They weren't familiar to me. And I think in that respect, that's the kind of historical fiction that I perhaps may find myself enjoying more.
Well, I think you're right, because why Mantel is like God's gift to earth is because she is able to transform characters that everyone knows and give them such depth that it's almost as if you believe she's genuinely met them. And I think Lucy Jago has a lot more latitude, because I had never heard, even though I am a historical fiction buff, though I didn't do a history degree, I wish I had done archaeology, but that's a whole other discussion. I had never heard of Anne or Frances at all. Obviously I knew who James the First is, but I just hadn't at all engaged with them, and so she was able to just create them from afresh. So for anyone who doesn't know, this book is set in the court of James the First in the 17th century. What happened is that a common woman called Anne Turner was executed by the king for her role in the death of a man called Mr. Overbury, who was a poet and courtier, close friend of James's favourite, and she was put to death, and afterwards she was vilified in the following years. And her mistress was Frances, who was the Earl of Essex's first wife. And Frances was also a powerhouse because she is one of the only women that was granted a bill of divorce. And so there's a few references in the history books about A, why Anne was executed, and B, what Frances had to go through to obtain her divorce from the Earl of Essex and what kind of man he was. And so this is the book of their friendship, and Lucy Jago imagines why Anne was killed and what led up to her death. I think we're not spoiling it, because on the back of the book it says, I'm 39 years old and I'm about to die or be pardoned. So I think it's very clear where this leads. This leads to the executioner's block, people. So we're not spoiling it.
As you say, this is very much a book about friendship. There's a really, I think, a really fantastic quote on the back. They are the Thelma and Louise of the 17th century, which I think is very much the case. The point to note is Frances Howard, the Howard dynasty have been close to the crown for forever. She was of the highest echelons of society, whereas Anne Turner is, as you say, she's a commoner. She's a commoner. And they managed to cross the social stratosphere and become friends, which must have been something incredibly unique to happen. And I loved their friendship. I felt there was something, not only something powerful in their friendship itself, but also I felt I could really relate to it. It seemed like a very modern friendship. It seemed like it was a dynamic you could have with your own friend today in the 21st century. It felt very relevant. And I think we've talked about this. What you see is you have Frances Howard, who is exquisitely beautiful. She's from tremendous wealth. She's married well, although we'll see not so well in fact, but, you know, on the face of it at least. And then you have Anne, who is often on the brink of sort of destitution, but really, when you look into this a bit further, who has it better? You know, it's not quite as clear as it seems.
Absolutely. Frances is miserable. She wants to die. Her husband, the Earl of Essex, it terrorizes her. And that's like in the opening scenes. And it's about who she falls in love with and how she gets out of this marriage. I mean, this book is basically...
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but when we're talking, because this is something we've talked about, how she gets out of this marriage, there is stuff in this book that will leave you with your jaw dropped to the ground, quite frankly. You will be shocked. You will be shocked. I am
My
so
God.
shocked.
You're so right. That's the beauty. There's this like book about friendship. This is a drama. This is a Netflix show waiting to happen, people. We need to get Shonda into this, okay? Because there are some jaw-dropping scenes.
Yeah.
You know, going back, Frances is miserable, as you said, but Anne has this liberation, but she's also so desperate at times, and it's so interesting to see this disparity, because Anne would never have got into court without Frances as her patron, and she sees the frivolity of, you know, them gambling a night, you know, paid for her entire road to eat for a year, and they're just, you know, losing it in wages. And I think that disparity in class is so brilliantly brought to life.
But Anne has that freedom that Frances can't ever have.
Ever. But then Anne is also, this is also about women autonomy and how women had no freedom, because really, yes, Anne was free to an extent, but she was waiting for her lover to marry her, and when he doesn't, she is left completely destitute. That's the truth, isn't it? I mean, she's worrying about how she's going to feed her children. When Anne was put to trial, the fact that she had another man in her life apart from her husband, that is historical. She's called a prostitute, a bawd, a witch, a sorcerer. And there's a mystical element to this book, and the capricious nature of the court is really brought to life, because you've got James I and who his favourite is and all the political machinations of that. But then you've also got that at times mysticism and witches and sorcery are in. Hello, Dr. D was Elizabeth I's scrivener. But then you've also got times where it's like the peak of disgrace. But I thought that was also really vividly.
Disgrace, and then you're off to Tyburn and you're hung there. I mean, that's ultimately what it comes down to. It's witchcraft. That's how it was put. That's how people were tried on that basis. One of the things that I really loved about this book was the style. I could totally see that TV series. I'm not sure if it's having recently watched Bridgerton, but I mean, it's the, I mean, I'll mention it. It's the yellow, the saffron yellow ruffs, which Anne Turner, this is what I mentioned in the end papers. I'm bringing them out again, but you can see them kind of more clearly now. Anne Turner brought a certain fashion and style to the court that even the Queen wanted in on. And I loved that dynamic, and it just made me think this is going to be a great, like, 4-part series at some point soon, perhaps. Having that dynamic, having that element thrown in is really captivating, actually.
Oh, 100%. I think it was just, she brought to life the time with little nuanced details and then really big things as well. I was a wreck by the end, with a discussion about motherhood and a woman's role in society, and you know, what it meant to either be part of the aristocracy or to be looking in was a big part of this book. And I think this book would appeal to someone who obviously likes historical fiction. That's second to none, buy it immediately. But also, if you're just interested in a woman's place in the world and how that process has led to us in England being much freer than our ancestors. And I think it was just, just a real triumph.
I'm not a huge fan of historical fiction, but I did really, really enjoy this book. So I think that's worth noting. If you're not a huge fan, this might be one worth giving a go. And I think, as I said, because although this happened in the 17th century, so much of it seems very weirdly contemporary. And I think that the crux of that is the friendship. So I think on that level, that core level, you'll you'll definitely be able to enjoy what you're reading. But I think, you know, as you say, I must echo your sentiments. The ending is heartbreaking, and it actually really reminded me of The Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel, the last moments of Cromwell, you know, knowing what was going to happen and what is going through someone's mind in those moments. I found both authors did an incredible job of conveying that.
So it's a big recommendation from us.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.